Thanks so much, Jen. You know, during the time of our shelter in place, we've all had time to contemplate after we get past the great pause into the great return, what is our world going to look like? Will it be more sustainable? Will we turn to alternative sources of energy? Well, someone who's been thinking a lot about it is our next guest. Please welcome Brian Goldstein of Energy Independence Now. Brian, welcome to the Great Pause.
Hi, David. Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So tell me exactly, besides obviously the name says what you do, Energy Independence Now, how did it come to be and what are you advocating for?
Well, Energy Independence Now is the only environmental nonprofit that just focuses on hydrogen. So we were founded about 20 years ago by former Cali PA Secretary Terry Tamminen to approach the concept of zero emission vehicles in California. We created the California Hydrogen Highway Initiative for then Governor Schwarzenegger, and we've continued to provide analysis to the state to push along funding for hydrogen refueling infrastructure. We work on legislation that pushes renewable content forward for hydrogen fueling in the transportation sector.
You know, I remember the first time I saw one of those hydrogen powered buses. And I thought, I wonder if that's going to catch on. But now I see them all over the place. I see them on the streets of Palm Springs and throughout Southern California with Sunline Transit. We see more hydrogen powered vehicles. I have a colleague who's actually putting together a project with a hydrogen fuel cell quadcopter or drone to deliver medication. Has hydrogen found its moment? And how big a catalyst has COVID-19 been towards what you're doing?
Well, it's interesting. Hydrogen is having its moment right now, and I'm a little concerned about the economic shutdown and the impact that it would have because we've really kind of reached this peak in momentum in the last year or so, and we've been very excited. It's been a long time in coming. Now, of course, the technology isn't old. It's been around forever. We've used it for space programs. We used it for the first submarine programs to provide oxygen instead of hydrogen on spacecraft and submarines. So this technology is mature. The problem is, and what's taken it so long to hit consumers' hands, is we haven't had the support infrastructure to fuel cell electric vehicles. So in other words, hydrogen stations. We've just reached this critical mass of over 40 hydrogen stations in California. The California state government is committed to building 100 stations. Right now we're working on trying to push that up to 200 stations. So I'd say very much that hydrogen is having its moment, and even well beyond transportation. There are other vital applications such as industrial decarbonization, where you're swapping out fossil hydrogen in industrial processes like refining oil with renewable hydrogen. There's disaster resilience, where you can actually take one of the vehicles that I'm driving every day, the Toyota Mirai, and add an auxiliary power component to it and use that to power your house in the event of a power shutdown. So there are many applications for renewable hydrogen. We focus primarily on transportation, and in recent years have really expanded to disaster resilience, industrial decarbonization, and so forth. Energy storage, actually, I should say, is a massive component of it as well that's very relevant to California. If you look at the curtailment numbers in California, we consistently produce more renewable energy than we're able to use, and then we end up having to waste it or pay other states to take it off of our hands. Now, if you look at the curtailment figures for 2020, they're absolutely fascinating because they're off the charts. Our typical power consumption numbers have kind of gone out the door with the shutdown this year, and we found that we are overproducing substantial amounts of renewable electricity. And of course, if we can capture that, and what I'm advocating for is capturing it in the form of renewable hydrogen, then we can return it back to the grid through fuel cells, or we can use it to fuel the transportation sector.
So you talk about critical mass. You said now there's 40 hydrogen fueling stations in California. You're trying to get them to build another 100 or 200. So that's 240. There are probably that many gasoline stations in East Los Angeles. You know, at what point do you get to a critical mass when the consumer says, you know what, it's as easy for me to buy a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, and it's just as easy for me to refuel it? How many would that take, and legislatively, what would it take to make this a reality?
So our vision is to try to reach 1,000 hydrogen stations by 2030. Now that's a heavy lift. There is a model where throughput as cars begin to hit the streets will make economic sense for station owners to go out and add hydrogen fueling capability to their existing businesses, which I think the writing is on the wall for oil and gas, right? So gas stations will be selling less and less gasoline over time. These are important small businesses. There's the ability to add these additional revenue drivers in the form of various alternative fuels. But in the zero emission world, there are only two, right? There are battery electric vehicles and there are fuel cell electric vehicles. The fact of the matter is that battery electric charging is relatively slow, right? You can, on a fast charger, charge a vehicle in anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. But that means on a gas station lot in a city like Los Angeles or San Francisco, that somebody would have to pull into a precious parking spot and sit there for about an hour, right? Whereas hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles refuel in about 3 to 5 minutes. And so you'd be able to push through, 20 plus vehicles in an hour at these stations. So we feel that once we hit 1,000 stations in California, that consumers would be able to drive kind of like they're used to with conventional liquid-fueled vehicles and not really feel inconvenienced by it.
Right. So, practical question. Probably several times a year, my husband and I drive from San Francisco to Palm Springs or Southern California, and we always say, okay, that's a tank of gas or a tank and a half or whatever it is. On a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, you can do that just in one fell swoop or not?
So technically with the ranges in the current fuel cell electric vehicles, they're all over 300 miles. So technically you can. Now the fact of the matter is maybe I have a heavy foot. I do need to stop and refuel my many trips to either the Bay Area or to Sacramento. So I stop one time in Coalinga. There's a station at the midway point. I spend 3 to 5 minutes there refueling while I see a lineup of, I think, 18 Tesla fast chargers where people are sleeping in their car in the heat out in the Central Valley and kind of just sitting there killing time. So there are these 18 chargers. If they're full, there are people waiting. Meanwhile, there are rarely people ahead of me at the hydrogen fuel cell electric fueling station there. And if I need to fuel up, I spend 5 minutes on the site and I'm back on my way to Sacramento or San Francisco in no time.
It's interesting. You mentioned probably the brand that has become most ubiquitous as far as electric cars, Tesla. Is there a car maker, or I shouldn't say car maker, because there's a lot of, I mentioned Sunline, they do buses, there's hydrogen fuel cell trucks. Is there a company that right now is saying, you know what, forget the Tesla or the Tesla knockoffs, we believe in hydrogen fuel cells for the future? Is there a company that's really spearheading this to make it more commercially available to truckers and just the average citizen?
Well, I'd say the company that is most committed to the technology right now is Toyota, and they are incredibly forward-leaning on this technology. In fact, I think if you look at the portfolio of cars that they've announced in the future, there are very few battery electric vehicles. And I mean, to my knowledge, I think single digits. They're firmly committed to this technology for several reasons, right? The range in the early models surpasses the range in the most expensive battery electric vehicles. The refueling time is there. The communal refueling concept is very important in a state like California, where over 50% of people live in multifamily housing. Many people don't have access to charging at home, much less a garage at home or a place to charge. And so hydrogen provides a refueling experience that's much more similar to that of what we're used to and what we've been used to for decades, almost 100 years in this country. So Toyota has kind of seen the writing on the wall. Look, they were kind of first to the punch with the Prius. They've been manufacturing batteries, hybrid electric components, all of these various components that go into similar vehicles for almost 20 years. And I think they've looked into the future, into the supply chain and said, hey, lithium and cobalt can be problematic in the future. The supply chain, where they come from, the labor practices, the end of life issues with those components, it's just very complicated. And I think that they see, the future of the automotive space being in fuel cells. Now, we have other companies that are selling light duty fuel cell electric vehicles in California right now. Honda and Hyundai are committed to the technology. And of course, we're seeing others around the world. And the heavy duty space, I think, provides a particular opportunity for fuel cell electric vehicles because if you look at the port of Los Angeles or the Twin Ports here in LA, we have roughly 17,000 heavy duty trucks. And imagine having to line a quarter of those 4,000 trucks up overnight for 10 to 12 hours to try to recharge them. What's
Right.
the spatial requirement? What's the infrastructure requirement? What's the back end requirement of transformers and the electrical system that would have to support that? Whereas those same trucks can refuel in about 20 minutes with hydrogen. And we're not as concerned with the payload that the batteries would take if in the battery electric versions of a heavy duty truck. The batteries alone could take up about 8,000 pounds, which is about 10% of the overall payload of the truck. So when you talk about heavy duty trucking, I think hydrogen fuel cells are a particularly good fit. And I think we'll see a lot of new heavy duty fuel cell electric trucks on the market in the near term.
Great. We've only got a few seconds left. What would you like to leave people with as far as your message? I mean, clearly you're one of the industry's major cheerleaders for hydrogen. And during COVID-19, I mean, literally people have looked out their windows, especially in Southern California and some cities across Asia, and for the first time seen blue sky in many months. Uh, has COVID given you an opportunity that you couldn't have had otherwise to actually literally see what the future of our skies could look like? And what message would you like to leave with those people who have now experienced clean air, sometimes for the first time in years?
Absolutely. Look, there have been some unexpected benefits to the shutdown. I know where I live in Los Angeles, I'm not too far from the freeway, I'm not too far from the airport. We've had the cleanest air in the 20 years that I've spent in Los Angeles. I've seen more wildlife around my neighborhood than I ever have before. It's been a really interesting display of what would happen if we could, lower emissions in the city, lower driving habits, and really, try to pay attention to zero emission transport. So my main message there is yes, we can. Si se puede, right? We have this opportunity where we can transition towards a zero emission future. Look, 4 months ago, we would have said that a universal income and healthcare for all is a pipe dream. How are we possibly going to pay for that? And suddenly we pull $2 trillion out of nowhere with the federal government. I know climate change seems like a daunting task. It seemed daunting to take the steps necessary to clean up the environment, to clean up our transportation sector. But if we put our minds to it and put a fraction of the resources and attention that we have toward COVID response towards climate change, in the future, I think there's a massive impact that we can have. So it is attainable. We can all do it, and we all, have a role that we can play in that process.
That's great. Thank you so much, Brian. Si se puede, exactamente. So, Jen, we've now learned how we can save our skies, clean energy, and come out of COVID maybe a better, cleaner, more sustainable society. Jen, what do you say to that?